The recovery room was a sanctuary of soft light and rhythmic beeps. In the center lay Leo, a 7-year-old boy who had remained perfectly still for 3 days. The specialized team had tried every standard protocol, physical stimuli, neurological tests, and bright lights. But Leo remained drifted away, locked in a silent world. Standing in the back was Maya, a new nurse on her very first week. While the experts looked at the high-tech monitors, Maya looked at the way Leo's fingers slightly twitched when a distant door closed. She stepped forward and whispered, "Can I try something?" No one knew exactly what would happen in there. The pediatric recovery unit was a place where miracles were supposed to happen, but for the last few days, it felt like a room of stagnant air. Maya moved through the ward with a quiet grace that made her almost invisible to the senior staff. She was a new hire, a term that usually meant she was expected to listen, observe, and stay out of the way. In the hierarchy of a busy hospital, a new nurse is a pair of hands, not a voice of authority. The scent of heavy antiseptic hung in the air, a sterile barrier between the vibrant world outside and the clinical stillness of the beds. Maya didn't mind the invisibility, she preferred it. It allowed her to see things that the busy specialists missed. While the doctors were calculating dosages and analyzing complex brain scans, Maya was the one who spent 8 hours a day in the silence of the room. She noticed the way the sunlight moved across the floor, tracing patterns on the white tile. She noticed the way the air conditioning hummed in the late afternoon, a low mechanical growl that filled the empty spaces between heartbeats. And she noticed Leo. Every time a nurse entered to check a drip, the room felt more like a laboratory than a place for a child. There were no toys, no bright colors, only the cold, polished steel of medical equipment. Maya felt a pang of sadness. A 7-year-old's world should be defined by the sound of running sneakers on grass, not the blinking of a pulse oximeter. She realized that the hospital's efficiency was inadvertently creating a sensory vacuum, a cage of perfection that offered no reason for a young mind to return. Leo was a bright-eyed boy who had suffered a minor but complicated concussion. He was stable according to every machine in the room. His vitals were perfect. His heart beat with the steady rhythm of a metronome. But Leo wasn't there. He was trapped in a state of unresponsive lethargy. He wasn't in a coma, but he wasn't awake. He was simply waiting. He looked as though he had simply decided that the world inside his head was safer than the cold, loud reality of the recovery unit. The senior staff treated Leo with professional care. They checked his pupils. They tapped his knees. They called his name in loud, clear voices. "Leo, can you hear me? Leo, squeeze my hand." But Leo remained a statue of marble. The experts began to discuss more aggressive treatments, worried that the boy was slipping into a deeper state of withdrawal. They looked at his brain as a circuit board with a loose wire, rather than a young life experiencing a profound sense of isolation. Maya watched from the corner of the room. She didn't have the years of experience that the others had, but she had a memory. She remembered a story her grandmother told her about a bird that wouldn't sing. The bird wasn't sick. It was just in a cage that was too quiet. Her grandmother used to say that a soul needs a song to find its way back home, especially when the path is clouded by fear. She noticed a tiny detail. Every time the heavy double doors at the end of the hallway swung shut with a muffled thud, Leo's left index finger would move just a fraction of a millimeter. It wasn't a reflex. It was an anticipation. He was listening. He was aware of the world, but the world was speaking to him in a language that was too clinical, too loud, and too sterile. He was reacting to the outside world, but only when it sounded like a familiar, physical presence. Maya felt the weight of being undervalued. She wanted to say something, but she was just the new nurse. She watched a senior consultant sigh in frustration as Leo failed yet another stimulus test. The consultant looked at the data, not the child, shaking his head at the lack of measurable progress. "He's just not responding," the doctor muttered, marking his chart. "We'll try the new protocol in the morning. If there's no change, we have to consider the long-term facility." Maya looked at Leo's pale face. She saw the way his eyelashes brushed against his cheeks. She didn't see a patient in bed 4. She saw a boy who was lonely in his own mind. She realized that the team was trying to pull him back to reality with force, using bright lights and loud voices. They were trying to break the silence rather than inviting him out of it. The viewers of this story might think that a hospital is all about medicine, but Maya knew that sometimes medicine is just the foundation. The healing happens in the spaces between the dosages. She had spent hours studying the patterns of Leo's stillness. She realized that he wasn't ignoring them. He was overwhelmed by them. The clinical environment was too much for a 7-year-old soul. It was a sensory overload of the wrong kind. Too many beeps, too little love. She spent the end of her shift thinking about what Leo would be doing if he were home. He wouldn't be listening to the beep of a heart monitor. He wouldn't be responding to the smell of antiseptic. He would be in the middle of noise. The real, messy, beautiful noise of life. He would be hearing his mother's voice in another room, or the sound of the TV, or the distant barking of a dog. As the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the recovery room, Maya decided that she couldn't stay in the background anymore. She didn't have the seniority to change the medical plan, but she had the compassion to change the atmosphere. She understood that treatable silence is not the same as nothingness. And for the first time in her career, she prepared herself to do something that wasn't in the manual. The next afternoon, the mood in the recovery unit was heavy with a sense of failure. The medical team had finished their morning rounds, and the verdict was the same: no progress. The lead physician was already discussing a transfer to a specialized long-term care facility. They were preparing to give up on the immediate recovery. The tension was palpable. The mother's quiet sobs were the only sound that broke the rhythmic clicking of the ventilators. Maya stood near the supply cart, her hands trembling slightly as she held a tray of fresh linens. She watched the doctors walk away, their footsteps echoing with a finality that felt wrong. The clinical certainty of their departure felt like a door slamming shut on Leo's future. She looked at Leo's mother, who was sitting by the bed, her face a map of exhaustion and grief, her eyes sunken from days of sleepless vigils. Maya knew that the clock was ticking. In the medical world, if you don't respond within a certain window, the temporary becomes permanent in the minds of the staff. She felt the tension of her own position. If she spoke up and failed, she would look foolish. If she spoke up and was ignored, she would be that nurse who didn't know her place. But the thought of Leo being shipped away to a place where he was just a number on a long-term list was unbearable. But she couldn't let Leo be transferred without a fight. She had seen that finger twitch again this morning, a small signal of a hidden consciousness trying to find a way out. It was a tiny crack in the wall, and she had to be the one to widen it. She walked toward the bed. She didn't rush. She didn't make a scene. She waited until the senior nurse, Elena, was the only one left in the room. Elena was a veteran, tough, efficient, and direct. She was currently adjusting Leo's IV bag, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "Elena?" Maya asked, her voice low. Elena looked up from the monitor. "Yes, Maya? We need to prep the transfer paperwork for bed 4. It needs to be ready by 4 p.m. "Can I try something first?" Maya asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an intensity that made Elena pause. Elena stopped. She looked at Maya, really looked at her, for the first time. She saw the determination in the younger woman's eyes. She saw the way Maya was looking at Leo, not at the screens. She saw a flicker of the passion she used to have before the years of hospital politics had worn her down. "Maya, we've tried everything," Elena said, her voice tired but not unkind. "We've used the light reflex tests, the cold water stimuli. He's just not coming back yet. The doctors are worried about the lack of synaptic response." "I think we're trying to pull him out," Maya said, "but maybe we should try to go in and get him." Elena frowned. "What does that mean?" "We're using clinical signals," Maya explained, stepping closer to the bed. "But he's a little boy. He's used to cartoons and messy rooms and the sound of someone humming in the kitchen. This room is too perfect. It's too empty. I think he's scared of the quiet. He's hiding from the sterile world we've built around him." The internal conflict was written on Elena's face. She knew the rules. She knew the protocols. She knew the risks of letting a junior nurse deviate from the established plan. But she also knew that they were about to send a 7-year-old to a facility where he might never wake up. The human cost of the protocol was becoming too high. "What are you proposing?" Elena asked. She glanced at the door, making sure the supervisor wasn't watching. "Just 10 minutes, Maya said. "I want to change the frequency of the room. I want to replace the beeps with something he knows." I want to give him a reason to open his eyes. Elena looked at the door. The doctors were gone. The unit was quiet, the midday lull providing a brief window of opportunity. She looked at the boy's mother, who was watching them with a spark of hope in her eyes, a desperate, fragile light that hadn't been there for days. 10 minutes, Elena whispered. But if anything shifts on the monitor, if his pressure spikes or his rhythm breaks, we stop immediately. Understood? Understood, Maya replied. Her heart was beating so loudly she was sure the monitors would pick it up. Maya didn't grab a needle. She didn't grab a flashlight. Instead, she asked the mother if Leo had a favorite song, something his father or mother used to sing when he was playing or falling asleep. She wanted a sound that bypasses the logical brain and goes straight to the heart. The mother whispered the name of a simple old folk song about a little bird in a meadow, a song that was rhythmic, gentle, and familiar. Her voice cracked as she spoke the title, the memory of her son's laughter feeling like a distant dream. Maya sat on the edge of the bed. This was the moment of decision. She was stepping outside the boundaries of clinical nursing and into the realm of human connection. She closed her eyes for a second, silencing the hum of the hospital in her own mind. She pictured the meadow in the song, trying to bring that warmth into the sterile bay. She didn't shout. She didn't call his name. She simply began to hum. At first, it was barely audible. It was a low, steady sound that blended with the rhythm of the heart monitor. Beep, hum, beep, hum. The other staff members in the hallway stopped. They looked through the glass window, their expressions a mix of confusion and skepticism. They saw the new girl sitting on the bed, doing something that wasn't in any textbook. They saw her closing her eyes, humming a melody that had no place in a high-tech recovery unit. To them, it looked like a waste of time. Maya felt the pressure of their gaze, but she didn't stop. She focused on the rhythm. She focused on the tiny movement of Leo's finger. She began to sing the lyrics, very softly, almost like a secret shared between friends. Little bird, fly through my window. She sang it slowly, matching her breath to the boys. She wasn't treating a concussion. She was talking to a child. She was building a bridge made of sound, reaching out into the dark where Leo was hiding. She wasn't a technician anymore. She was a guide, leading him back from the shadows. Minutes passed. 5 minutes. 7 minutes. The skeptics in the hallway began to murmur, pointing at their watches. They were waiting for her to stop, to admit that it didn't work, so they could get back to their real medical duties. Maya felt the doubt in the room rising like a tide, but she didn't look up. She just kept singing. She ignored the clicking of the door and the shadow of the intern in the doorway. She believed that silence wasn't a wall. It was a conversation that hadn't started yet. And as the 10-minute mark approached, Maya reached out and gently placed her hand over Leo's small waxy fingers. She didn't squeeze. She just waited. She felt the heat of his skin, a small, stubborn spark of life that refused to go out. The 10 minutes were almost up. In the hallway, a junior doctor checked his watch and prepared to enter the room to tell Maya to stop. Elena stood by the monitor, her eyes fixed on the heart rate. There was no change, no miracle spike, no sudden awakening. Maya didn't stop singing. Her voice was steady, even though her heart was racing. She was on the final verse of the song, the part about the bird finding its way home. Little bird, you're home now. Suddenly, the heart monitor chirped. It wasn't an alarm. It was a subtle shift, a tiny acceleration in the beat. It went from 60 beats per minute to 64, then 68. Elena leaned in closer. Maya, she whispered. Stay with him, Maya said, her voice not breaking the melody. Then it happened. It wasn't like the movies. There was no gasping for air, no dramatic shouting. Leo's left hand, the one that had been a statue for 3 days, slowly turned over. His palm met Maya's palm. It was the smallest movement imaginable, a mere shift of an inch. But to the people in that room, it was an earthquake. Leo's eyelids fluttered, not with a reflex, but with effort. He was trying to open them. He was fighting the weight of the lethargy. Maya kept singing, her voice now filled with a quiet joy. She was the lighthouse, and Leo was finally seeing the beam. Leo, she whispered between the lyrics, you're doing great. Just follow the song." The boy's mouth moved. No sound came out, but his lips formed a shape, a tiny, silent O. In the hallway, the skeptics were frozen. The doctor, who was about to enter the room, stopped mid-stride, his hand on the door handle. He saw the monitor. He saw the hand movement. He saw the new nurse doing the one thing that all their machines couldn't do. He realized that the problem wasn't the boy's brain, it was his spirit. The clinical tests were like knocking on a door with a sledgehammer. Leo had simply retreated further inside to get away from the noise. But Maya had knocked with a feather. She had invited him out with a song he knew, a song that represented safety and love. "Did you see that?" the medical student whispered from the door. Everyone was seeing it now. Leo's eyes finally opened. They were foggy, and he looked confused, but they were open. He looked at Maya. He didn't look at the machines or the doctors. He looked at the person who was singing. The soft twist of this story is that Maya didn't perform a medical miracle. She simply performed an act of deep listening. She realized that in a world of high-tech data, we often forget the basic data of human emotion. Leo had been overstimulated by clinical noise and understimulated by human connection. Maya stopped singing. The room returned to its sterile quiet, but the air felt different. It was no longer stagnant. "Hi, Leo," Maya said softly. "Big bird," Leo whispered. His voice was raspy, barely a ghost of a sound, but it was the most beautiful thing his mother had ever heard. The mother collapsed into tears, holding her son's other hand. The doctors entered the room, but this time, they didn't push Maya aside. They stood back. They watched as the new girl finished the transition. Maya explained it to them later, not with arrogance, but with a simple insight. "He wasn't lost," she said. "He was just waiting for someone to speak his language. We kept telling him to wake up, but we didn't give him a reason to." The team was silent. They were looking at their charts, their scans, and their high-priced equipment. They realized that they had been treating a body, but Maya had been treating a child. This moment wasn't a shock to the medical system. It was a soft respect that began to settle into the unit. It was the realization that different isn't always wrong. Maya had used her lack of experience as a strength. She hadn't yet been trained to ignore her intuition. She hadn't yet been taught to trust the machine more than the person. Leo was moved to a standard pediatric ward a few hours later. The transfer to the long-term facility was canceled. He was back. He had a long road of physical therapy ahead of him, but the silence had been broken. As Maya finished her shift, she saw Elena at the nursing station. Elena didn't say much. She just reached out and squeezed Maya's shoulder. "Good catch, Maya," Elena said. "I think we all learned something today." Maya nodded, her heart full. She realized that her value wasn't in her seniority or her title. It was in her willingness to not treat silence as nothing. She had learned that the most powerful thing a nurse can do is to listen to the things that aren't being said. As she walked out of the hospital, she heard a bird chirping in a tree near the entrance. She smiled. She knew that Leo would be hearing that same sound very soon. She had opened the window, and the bird had finally found its way home. The story of Leo and the singing nurse spread through the hospital like a gentle breeze. It wasn't a scandalous story or a dramatic debate. It was a ripple of awareness. The next week, Maya noticed a change in the recovery unit. It wasn't a total overhaul of the rules, but the atmosphere had shifted. The doctors started asking the families more questions, not just about medical history, but about the patients' lives. Does she like music? What's his favorite movie? Is there a specific scent that makes him feel safe? They were starting to collect a different kind of data. They were starting to look for the bridges that Maya had talked about. Maya remained humble. She was still a new nurse, still doing her quiet work. But she noticed that people listened when she spoke. During the morning briefings, when she pointed out a small observation, a change in a patient's facial expression, or a subtle shift in their posture, the senior staff didn't dismiss her. They paused. They looked. They considered. One afternoon, a senior doctor approached Maya. He was a man known for his cold, clinical approach. "Maya," he said, stopping her in the hallway, "I have a patient in room 302, an elderly woman. She's stable, but she's withdrawn. We've tried the standard interventions." He paused, looking a bit uncomfortable. "Do you think you could, sit with her for a few minutes? Just to observe?" Maybe you'll see a rhythm we're missing." Maya smiled. "I'd be happy to, doctor." She realized that she had changed the mindset of the unit. She hadn't replaced science with emotion. She had integrated them. She had shown them that a hospital can be both a place of high-tech medicine and a place of high-touch connection. This is the real ripple effect. It wasn't just about Leo. It was about the dozens of patients who would follow him. It was about the culture of the hospital becoming a little more human, a little more patient, and a little more observant. The junior nurses started to feel more empowered. They realized that their observations mattered. They started to look for the small wrongs and the tiny rights. They realized that they were the primary observers of the human spirit in the ward. Maya saw Elena teaching a new student nurse a few days later. Elena was standing by a bedside, but she wasn't looking at the monitor. She was talking to the student about the importance of listening to the quiet. "Don't just look at the numbers," Elena said. "The numbers tell you if the heart is beating, but the patient tells you if they're actually there. Pay attention to the silence. It's never empty." Maya felt a profound sense of peace. She had found her place. She wasn't just a gear in a machine anymore. She was a bridge builder. She was the one who looked for the song in the silence. As she walked through the ward, she realized that the hospital didn't sound as loud anymore. The beeps and the hums were still there, but they were background noise now. The real sound was the sound of voices, people talking, people listening, and occasionally someone humming a song to a bird that was trying to find its way home. The story of Maya and Leo is a reminder for all of us, not just those in the medical profession. It is a story about the way we interact with the world around us. We live in an age of constant noise. We are surrounded by data, notifications, and loud opinions. We are taught that if something isn't loud, it isn't important. We are taught that doing more is always the answer to a problem. But sometimes the answer isn't to do more. It's to do something different. It's to change the frequency. Maya's superpower was her ability to recognize that silence is a signal. In Leo's case, his silence was a form of protection. He had retreated into himself because the world outside was too harsh, too clinical, and too loud. By singing to him, Maya wasn't just giving him music. She was giving him a safe place to land. How many times in our own lives do we encounter someone who is silent? A friend who has stopped calling, a coworker who has become withdrawn, a child who has stopped sharing their day. Our instinct is often to push. We ask louder questions, we demand responses, we try to pull them out of their silence. But maybe like Maya, we should try to go in and get them. Maybe we should try to speak their language instead of demanding they speak ours. Intuition is not a magic feeling. It is the result of deep observation. It is the ability to see the patterns that everyone else is rushing past. Maya saw the finger twitch because she was patient enough to wait for it. She heard the silence because she was quiet enough to listen to it. In your work, in your relationships, and in your daily life, don't ignore the silence. Don't treat it as nothing. Sometimes the smallest response is the one that matters most. A tiny movement, a whispered word, a slight shift in a gaze. These are the bridges that connect us to one another. Leo is back in school now. He's running, playing, and making plenty of noise. But every time he sees a nurse, he gives them a special kind of smile. He knows that they are the ones who are listening. Maya continues her work at the hospital. She's no longer the new girl, but she still carries that same sense of quiet observation. She still sits on the edge of the bed and waits for the bird to fly through the window. The lesson is simple. Listen more than you speak. Observe more than you react. And never ever assume that silence is empty. One move, total silence, and a song that brought a boy home. What silence will you listen to today? What song will you choose to hum? The world is waiting for someone to pay attention. Will it be you?